September 23, 1543. A storm-battered Chinese junk wallowed in the swells off Tanegashima Island, southern Japan. Two Portuguese traders aboard, Antonio da Mota and Francisco Zé Moto, had no idea they were about to change Japanese warfare forever. The local lord, Tanegashima Tokitaka, a 16-year-old daimyo with a keen eye for innovation, watched from shore as the damaged vessel limped into harbour. Among the cargo that would be unloaded that day were two matchlock arquebuses, weapons that would shatter centuries of warrior tradition and rewrite the rules of samurai combat within a single generation. Japan in 1543 was a nation consuming itself. The Sengoku period, the age of warring states, had turned the archipelago into a patchwork of feuding domains. For nearly a century, the Ashikaga shogunate had existed only in name. Real power belonged to the daimyo, regional warlords who carved territories from each other's domains in an endless cycle of ambition and bloodshed. This was a world defined by the samurai, the warrior nobility whose culture had evolved over 4 centuries into something approaching religious devotion. The samurai warrior of the mid-16th century was the product of centuries of refinement. His primary weapons were the bow and the sword, each requiring years of dedicated training to master. The yumi, the asymmetric Japanese longbow, stood over 2 meters tall and demanded a lifetime to perfect. Samurai archers could loose arrows with deadly accuracy from horseback, a skill passed down through generations of noble families. But it was the sword that defined the samurai soul. The katana, forged through weeks of labour by master swordsmiths, was more than a weapon. It was the physical embodiment of Bushido, the way of the warrior, a code that emphasized loyalty, honour, courage and dignity unto death. A samurai without his sword was considered incomplete. To lose one's katana meant losing one's honour, a disgrace that could only be remedied through ritual suicide. This was a culture built on centuries of tradition. Samurai warfare followed elaborate codes of conduct. Warriors announced their names and lineages before combat. Single combat between mounted samurai could decide the outcome of battles. Fighting was supposed to be honourable, face to face, a test of individual skill and courage refined through years of training. The very structure of samurai society reinforced this system. Unlike Europe, where nobility comprised less than 1% of the population, Japan's warrior class made up nearly 10% of society. These men had invested their entire lives and their family legacies in mastering the arts of archery and swordsmanship. Then 2 Portuguese traders stepped onto Tanegashima Island, carrying weapons that required virtually no skill to use effectively. Lord Tokitaka watched in fascination as the foreigners demonstrated their matchlocks. The weapons were crude by later standards, smoothbore tubes of forged iron, about 4 feet long, weighing perhaps 10 pounds. A serpentine lever held a length of slow-burning match cord. When the trigger was pulled, the glowing match dropped into a pan of gunpowder, igniting the main charge and propelling a lead ball down the barrel at over 1,000 feet per second. The effective range was only about 80 to 100 meters, and an experienced archer could fire 15 arrows in the time it took to load and fire the arquebus once. In rain, the weapon became useless as the powder dampened. Yet there was something terrifying about the weapon's simplicity. A peasant farmer could learn to fire an arquebus in weeks. That same farmer would need years to become even a mediocre archer and decades to master the sword. The matchlock democratized death in a way that threatened the very foundation of samurai culture. Tokitaka recognized the implications immediately. He purchased both weapons for an astronomical sum and summoned Yaita Kinbei Kiyosada, one of his swordsmiths. The command was simple: replicate these weapons. The swordsmith examined the arquebuses with professional curiosity. Most of the weapon was straightforward, well within the capabilities of Japanese metallurgy. For centuries, Japanese smiths had been producing the finest swords in the world through elaborate processes of folding and tempering steel. Creating a simple iron tube presented no challenge. But one component stumped them entirely. The breech screw, the threaded plug that sealed the rear of the barrel, required a technology unknown in Japan. Drilling a helical groove into metal so that a matching screw could seal the chamber without gas leakage was beyond the swordsmith's experience. For nearly a year, the project stalled on this single technical problem. Then, in 1544, Portuguese traders returned. Tokitaka convinced them to bring back a skilled blacksmith who could demonstrate the threading technique. Within months of learning this single missing piece, Japanese smiths were producing matchlocks that equaled or exceeded European quality. The transformation happened with stunning speed. By the end of 1544, mass production had begun. The port city of Sakai, near Osaka, became the center of firearms manufacturing. Kunitomo village in Omi province established workshops that would produce weapons for 3 centuries. Nagoro-ji Temple in Kishu province, home to warrior monks, became another major production center. These weren't cottage industries. Within 5 years of the first Portuguese matchlock arriving in Japan, workshops were producing thousands of weapons annually. This speed of adoption reflected both Japanese craftsmanship and desperate necessity. The Sengoku period showed no signs of ending. Daimyo who failed to adapt died. Those who embraced new technology, however unconventional, survived. In 1549, just 6 years after the Portuguese landing, Oda Nobunaga ordered 500 matchlocks for his armies. The teenage lord of Owari province had no patience for tradition, when innovation offered victory. Other daimyo followed. By the 1560s, Sakai and Kunitomo were producing several thousand arquebuses per year, meeting demand that seemed insatiable. But production was one thing. Integration into samurai warfare was entirely different. The arquebus threatened everything the warrior class stood for. It was the weapon of peasants, of a Shigeru foot soldiers drawn from the farming class. It required no noble breeding, no years of training, no family legacy of martial arts. A farmer's son could kill a samurai lord from 100 meters away with a month's practice. This was an abomination to everything Bushido represented. The samurai class had always disdained certain weapons. Ninja, the practitioners of espionage and assassination, were considered dishonorable specifically because they used stealth and trickery instead of facing enemies directly. The arquebus was worse. It allowed killing without skill, without honor, without even looking your enemy in the eye. Many samurai initially refused to use firearms, considering them beneath their dignity. But necessity has a way of overriding tradition. The daimyo who clung to honor while their rivals adopted firearms found their domains conquered and their families exterminated. The early battlefield use of arquebuses was tentative and experimental. The first recorded deployment came in 1549 when the Shimazu clan used matchlocks during fighting on Kyushu. The results were mixed. The weapons were slow to load, unreliable in Japan's humid climate, and of questionable effectiveness against armoured samurai at typical combat ranges. An arrow could penetrate armour at 80 meters. An arquebus ball at the same range often simply bounced off. The weapon's psychological impact, however, was undeniable. The thunderous report and smoke, the mysterious death it delivered, created terror among troops who had never encountered gunfire. Throughout the 1550s and 1560s, daimyo across Japan experimented with integrating firearms into traditional warfare. They created specialized gunner units, usually composed of ashigaru rather than samurai. These units would deliver opening volleys before traditional forces closed for melee combat. The arquebuses became one element in combined arms tactics that still centered on samurai skill in archery and swordsmanship. Then came Oda Nobunaga, and everything changed. Nobunaga was born in 1534 to a minor daimyo family in Owari province. From childhood, he displayed an unsettling willingness to break with tradition. While other young nobles studied tea ceremony and calligraphy, Nobunaga consorted with commoners and foreign traders. He wore unconventional clothing and showed little respect for ceremony. Other daimyo called him the Fool of Owari. The fool, however, understood something they didn't. Honor meant nothing to a dead man, and tradition was worthless to a conquered province. In 1560, Nobunaga achieved his first great victory at Okehazama, where his 3,000 troops ambushed and destroyed a 25,000-strong army under Imagawa Yoshimoto. The victory owed more to surprise and tactical brilliance than firearms, but it established Nobunaga's reputation as a commander who valued results over convention. Throughout the 1560s, he steadily expanded his domain, always willing to adopt new methods. He cultivated relationships with Portuguese traders, ensuring steady supplies of lead, saltpeter, and firearms technology. He encouraged firearms production in Sakai and other manufacturing centers. Most importantly, he thought deeply about how to use these weapons effectively. By 1575, Nobunaga had spent 15 years refining his understanding of firearm warfare. He had studied reports from every battle where arquebuses played a role. He understood their strengths, their limitations, and most crucially, how to compensate for their weaknesses. The Battle of Nagashino would become his masterpiece, the moment when firearms truly shattered samurai tradition. The campaign began in May 1575, when Takeda Katsuyori, son of the legendary Takeda Shingen, laid siege to Nagashino Castle with 15,000 troops. The Takeda clan was the most fearsome military force in Japan. Takeda Shingen, who had died 2 years earlier, had revolutionized cavalry warfare. In an era when mounted samurai primarily used bows, Shingen transformed his cavalry into lancers, creating the Takeda Kiba Gunden, the mounted army. These cavalry charges had proven devastatingly effective, most famously at the Battle of Mikitagahara in 1573, where they routed Tokugawa Ieyasu's forces. The Takeda cavalry were considered unstoppable, an embodiment of samurai martial superiority. Their reputation was such that enemies often fled at the sight of their distinctive red armour. When Nagashino Castle's commander sent desperate pleas for help, Tokugawa Ieyasu faced an impossible decision. His own forces, perhaps 8,000 men, stood no chance against the Takeda army. But Ieyasu had an ally, Oda Nobunaga. The alliance between these two would eventually unify Japan, but in 1575 it was primarily a marriage of convenience. Ieyasu needed Nobunaga's strength. Nobunaga saw an opportunity to destroy the Takeda threat permanently. On June 21st, Nobunaga marched from Gifu with 30,000 troops. Combined with Ieyasu's forces, the relief army numbered 38,000, giving them more than 2-to-1 superiority. But Nobunaga wasn't counting on numbers alone. When the Allied army arrived near Nagashino on June 27th, Nobunaga made a decision that baffled traditional commanders. Instead of marching directly to relieve the castle, he deployed his forces on the Shitaragahara plain about 3 miles to the west. The position was strong. His northern flank rested on high ground at Mount Gambo. His southern flank anchored on the Toyokawa River. In front of his line ran the Rengogawa, a small stream with steep banks that would slow any cavalry charge. But Nobunaga added something unprecedented. He ordered his troops to construct a wooden palisade, a fence about 2 kilometers long running along his entire front. The barricade wasn't solid. It was built in sections with gaps every 50 yards, creating what modern military theorists would call a checkerboard defense. Behind this palisade, Nobunaga positioned his arquebuses. Historical sources conflict on the exact number. The most reliable early account, the Shincho Koki, mentions 1,000 matchlocks divided among 5 commanders. Later sources claim 3,000 guns arranged in 3 ranks for rotating volley fire. Modern historians lean toward the lower figure, but debate continues. The exact number matters less than what Nobunaga understood about firearm warfare. The arquebus had 3 critical weaknesses. It was slow to reload, taking perhaps 30 seconds for an experienced gunner. It was vulnerable while reloading, as gunners were essentially defenseless until they could fire again, and it required stable footing to aim accurately. The palisade addressed all 3 problems simultaneously. It protected gunners while reloading. It broke up cavalry charges before they could reach the gunners. The gaps allowed for counterattacks by spearmen and swordsmen when the enemy closed. It was a defensive system purpose-built around firearm tactics. Nobunaga's deployment also broke with samurai tradition in a revolutionary way. Traditionally, firearms units were composed entirely of ashigaru, commanded loosely if at all. Nobunaga placed his finest samurai officers in direct command of the gunner units. Men from his Horoshu, his elite personal bodyguard, commanded groups of 30 to 50 arquebusiers each. This decision outraged traditional samurai. Members of the warrior nobility, men who had trained in martial arts since childhood, were being asked to command peasants with guns. It violated every principle of samurai hierarchy, but it ensured discipline, coordination, and effective use of firepower. Takeda Katsuyori faced a choice. He could abandon the siege of Nagashino and withdraw, preserving his army but admitting failure. Or he could attack Nobunaga's defensive position, betting that Takeda cavalry could shatter the Oda Tokugawa lines just as they had shattered every other enemy. Katsuyori's older generals urged withdrawal. They understood the danger of attacking a fortified position with superior numbers. But Katsuyori was young, ambitious, and eager to prove himself worthy of his father's legacy. On the evening of June 27th, he made his decision. the Takeda army would attack at dawn. Through the night of June 27th to 28th, Takeda forces moved into position. Leaving 3,000 men to maintain the siege of Nagashino Castle, Katsuyori advanced with 12,000 troops in 4 divisions of 3,000 each. Rain poured down, and Katsuyori smiled. Wet powder meant useless matchlocks. The Oda forces would be reduced to spears and swords, weapons where Takeda's superiority was unquestionable. What Katsuyori didn't know was that Nobunaga had kept his powder and matchlocks dry under cover throughout the night. As dawn broke on June 28, 1575, the Takeda vanguard saw the Oda Tokugawa lines arrayed across the plain. The wooden palisade looked flimsy, easily overcome by a determined charge. Behind it they could see gunners and spearmen, but the defensive line seemed thin. Katsuyori ordered the advance. The Takeda cavalry began their legendary charge, thousands of mounted samurai in full armour thundering across the plain toward the wooden fence. The Rengogawa stream slowed them, as Nobunaga had calculated. Horses stumbled on the steep banks. The perfect formations broke apart, but the cavalry pressed on, reforming as they cleared the obstacle. At 100 metres from the palisade, they accelerated into full charge. At 80 metres, the matchlocks opened fire. The sound was unlike anything heard on Japanese battlefields before. Not individual shots, but rolling thunder as hundreds of guns discharged in coordinated sequence. Smoke obscured the battlefield. Through the smoke, Takeda cavalry and horses fell, not by ones and twos, but by dozens. Lead balls travelling at supersonic speeds tore through armour that had stopped arrows. Horses screamed and collapsed. Men fell from their saddles, but the Takeda pressed on. This was the moment that defined samurai culture, charging into death with courage and honour. The second volley crashed out, then the third, the casualties mounted. Still the Takeda came, climbing over dead horses and fallen comrades, closing the distance to the hated wooden fence. Some reached the palisade. Spearmen thrust through the gaps, stabbing at horses and riders. Samurai with swords engaged Takeda warriors who had dismounted and forced their way through. The fighting became savage, personal, the kind of combat samurai understood. But for every Takeda warrior who reached the fence, 2 more fell to gunfire before getting close. The arquebusiers maintained their fire, reloading, aiming, shooting with mechanical precision under the direction of samurai officers who understood discipline. Waves of Takeda cavalry charged again and again, each assault breaking against the wooden palisade and the wall of lead it protected. The Takeda officer corps, the finest samurai in Japan, died with suicidal courage. Yamagata Masakage, one of the 24 generals of Takeda, led his men in red armour straight into the gunfire. He fell in front of the palisade. Naito Masatoyo, another of the 24 generals, died leading a charge against the southern section. Baba Nobuharu, perhaps the most respected Takeda general, was killed attempting to break through the centre. By mid-afternoon, the Takeda army was broken. Of the 12,000 men who had advanced that morning, perhaps 10,000 lay dead or dying on the field. The exact casualty figure remains disputed, with some sources claiming only 3,000 dead, others as many as 10,000. What's undisputed is the devastation among the Takeda leadership. Of 97 named Takeda commanders, 54 were killed. 8 of the 24 generals, the elite of the Takeda clan, died at Nagashino. The survivors retreated in disorder, pursued by Oda Tokugawa forces who showed no mercy. Takeda Katsuyori escaped with perhaps 2,000 men. He had lost 2/3 of his army and most of his experienced commanders in a single day. The Takeda clan, which had dominated Japanese warfare for decades, would never recover. 7 years later, in 1582, Oda and Tokugawa forces would invade Takeda lands. The clan's retainers, demoralized and leaderless, simply abandoned Katsuyori. He committed suicide, and the Takeda bloodline ended. But the true casualty of Nagashino was samurai tradition itself. The battle proved that centuries of training in archery and swordsmanship could be negated by peasants with matchlocks and a few weeks' practice. The mounted samurai charge, the epitome of warrior culture, had been reduced to slaughter. Individual courage and martial skill meant nothing against coordinated firearm tactics. The lesson was harsh and undeniable: adapt or die. The aftermath of Nagashino sent shockwaves through Japan's military establishment. Daimyo who had resisted firearms now scrambled to acquire them. Production at Sakai, Kunitomo, and other centres exploded. Some estimates suggest that by the end of the Sengoku period, Japan possessed 500,000 to 600,000 firearms, making it the most heavily armed nation on Earth. European observers were stunned by the scale of Japanese gun ownership. The transformation happened within a single generation. In 1543, Japan had 0 firearms. By 1590, it had more guns than any European nation. This arms build-up changed Japanese warfare fundamentally. Armies grew larger as daimyo recruited thousands of Ashigori gunners. The ratio of commoners to samurai in military forces shifted dramatically. Battles became exercises in firepower and logistics, rather than demonstrations of individual martial prowess. The romantic ideal of samurai combat, the face-to-face duel between skilled warriors, became increasingly rare. Wars were won by the side that could field more guns and keep them supplied with powder and shot. The cultural impact was profound and troubling to traditional samurai. The entire structure of their society rested on the belief that martial skill required years of training accessible only to the warrior nobility. This justified their privileged position, their tax exemptions, their power over commoners. If a peasant with a matchlock could kill a samurai lord, what justified samurai privilege? Some domains attempted to restrict firearm use to the samurai class, but this proved impractical. The weapons were too effective, and peasant gunners too readily available. The genie couldn't be stuffed back in the bottle. Yet Japanese society found ways to preserve samurai culture, even as firearms undermined its foundations. The sword remained the symbol of samurai status. Only members of the warrior class could legally wear swords in public. The katana became even more important as a status marker precisely because its military utility declined. Elaborate sword forging traditions continued, with master swordsmiths producing blades of extraordinary quality that were primarily ceremonial. Samurai continued to train in kenjutsu, sword arts, even as battles were decided by gunfire. The disconnect between training and battlefield reality grew, but the cultural importance of the sword actually increased. In 1592, Japan demonstrated its firearm superiority on the international stage during the invasions of Korea. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who had completed Nobunaga's unification of Japan after Nobunaga's assassination, launched an invasion with 160,000 troops. Approximately 40,000 of these were arquebusiers. The Japanese forces advanced rapidly, capturing Seoul just 18 days after landing. Korean and Ming Chinese forces, accustomed to different styles of warfare, were initially overwhelmed by the concentrated firepower. Korean records noted that Japanese arquebuses could reach beyond several hundred paces, a range far exceeding Korean bows. The psychological impact was devastating. However, the invasion ultimately failed due to overextended supply lines, Korean naval superiority under Admiral Yi Sun-sin, and the intervention of massive Ming armies. But the military capability Japan demonstrated shocked Asia. A nation that had been largely isolated had, within 50 years of acquiring firearms, become a military powerhouse. Chinese and Korean observers noted the quality and quantity of Japanese guns with alarm. The matchlocks produced in Sakai and Kunitomo were considered superior even to European weapons due to the extraordinary skill of Japanese craftsmen. Then, at the height of Japan's firearms development, something unexpected happened. Japan stopped innovating. In 1600, Tokugawa Ieyasu won the Battle of Sekigahara, the decisive conflict that ended the Sengoku period and established the Tokugawa shogunate. 3 years later, the Edo period began, named after Ieyasu's capital, the city that would become Tokyo. The Tokugawa imposed peace through absolute control. No daimyo could build castles without permission. Political marriages required shogunal approval. Daimyo had to spend alternate years in Edo, ensuring their good behavior. Under this rigid peace, Japan's need for firearms plummeted. The great civil wars were over. No external enemies threatened the islands. Tokugawa policy actively discouraged firearms development and use. In 1607, the shogunate ordered all gunsmiths to relocate to Nagahama, allowing centralized control. Only Sakai's smiths were exempted because the shogun's authority was weaker there. Gun production continued, but it was carefully regulated. Contrary to popular myth, Japan didn't abandon firearms entirely. Archaeological evidence suggests 150,000 to 200,000 firearms remained in circulation throughout the Edo period. But their social role changed fundamentally. Without wars to fight, matchlocks became tools rather than weapons. Farmers used them to scare birds from crops. Samurai used them for hunting and target practice. They were stored in armories, maintained but rarely used. Meanwhile, European firearms technology advanced dramatically. Flintlock mechanisms replaced matchlocks, offering faster ignition and better reliability in wet conditions. Rifles with spiral-grooved barrels provided far greater accuracy than smoothbore muskets. Breech-loading designs allowed much faster reloading. These innovations never reached Japan, or when they did, were largely ignored. The matchlock, the weapon that had revolutionized Japanese warfare in the 16th century, remained essentially unchanged for 250 years. This technological stagnation reflected deliberate policy. The Tokugawa shogunate recognized that firearms threatened social stability. They enabled peasant rebellions and made daimyo harder to control. By limiting firearms development and restricting their use, the shogunate helped preserve samurai status. In peacetime, when guns weren't needed for war, the sword could reign supreme again. Samurai culture experienced a renaissance during the Edo period. With no battles to fight, samurai became administrators, scholars, and artists. The principles of Bushido were codified and refined. The tea ceremony, calligraphy, poetry, all the peaceful arts flourished. The samurai transformed from warriors into bureaucrats, but they maintained the fiction of martial superiority through dedication to sword arts and the idealized codes of honor. This peaceful era lasted until 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry's American fleet arrived demanding Japan open to trade. The Japanese were shocked to discover how far they had fallen behind Western military technology. Perry's steam-powered warships, modern cannon, and advanced small arms made Japanese matchlocks look medieval by comparison. The shogunate, weakened by internal problems and external pressure, began to crumble. Various samurai factions acquired modern Western firearms, minié rifles, breech loaders, even repeating rifles. The technological gap that had opened during 250 years of isolation closed within a decade through frantic purchasing and copying. But it was too late for the samurai class. In 1868, the Meiji Restoration overthrew the shogunate and restored imperial rule. The new government was determined to modernize Japan rapidly. In 1872, they issued a decree banning the public wearing or use of swords. This single act destroyed the legal foundation of samurai status. The warrior class, which had dominated Japan for nearly 1,000 years, was abolished. In 1873, the government instituted universal conscription, creating a national army composed of commoners equipped with modern rifles. Peasants could now legally carry guns, while samurai could not legally carry swords. The reversal was complete and brutal. Some samurai resisted. The Satsuma Rebellion of 1877 saw traditional samurai, wearing armor and wielding swords, charge against conscript forces armed with modern rifles. The result was inevitable. The samurai were slaughtered. It was Nagashino replayed on an even more tragic scale, the death throes of a warrior culture that had survived for centuries but could not survive industrialization. The matchlock, introduced to Tanegashima Island in 1543, had set in motion a transformation that would eventually destroy the very class that had made Japan the most heavily armed nation on earth. The irony is profound. The samurai had enthusiastically adopted firearms when military necessity demanded it. They had built the largest stockpile of guns in the world. Japanese craftsmen had produced weapons that European observers considered superior to their own. But the very success of firearms undermined the foundations of samurai culture. The skills that took a lifetime to master, the traditions passed down through generations, the codes of honor that defined the warrior class, all became irrelevant when a peasant's musket ball could kill a master swordsman from 100 meters away. Looking back from the 21st century, we can see the Battle of Nagashino as a pivotal moment not just in Japanese history, but in the global story of military technology. It was one of the first battles where firearms decisively defeated traditional cavalry, predating similar European battles by decades. The tactical innovations Nobunaga employed, using fortifications to protect gunners and coordinating fire through disciplined command, anticipated developments that would dominate 17th and 18th century European warfare. Japan, isolated and engaged in civil war, independently developed firearm tactics that matched or exceeded anything seen in the West. Yet the lesson of Nagashino cuts deeper than military tactics. It's a story about technology and tradition, about how innovation can destroy the very culture that embraces it. The samurai saw firearms as tools to win battles. They didn't foresee that those tools would make samurai obsolete. They couldn't imagine that the weapons they used to dominate Japan would eventually be turned against them by commoner conscripts. The matchlock that Lord Tanegashima purchased from Portuguese traders in 1543 was a seed that took 334 years to fully germinate. But when it did, it consumed the samurai class entirely. Today, the matchlock arquebuses that revolutionized Japanese warfare rest in museums. They are beautiful objects, testament to the skill of 16th century craftsmen. Their wooden stocks are often lacquered and inlaid with precious metals. Their barrels are inscribed with poetry and maker's marks. They look more like works of art than weapons of war, which is fitting. For the samurai, these weapons were always uncomfortable, a necessary compromise with practicality that violated everything Bushido represented. They won battles but destroyed honor. They secured peace but at the cost of tradition. The story that began on Tanegashima Island in 1543 ended on the fields of Kyushu in 1877, when the last samurai fell to rifle fire from conscript armies. In between, firearms transformed Japan from a feudal society of honor-bound warriors to a modern nation-state. The arquebus that Portuguese traders sold to a teenage lord became the instrument that shattered 1,000 years of tradition. The thunder of matchlocks at Nagashino in 1575 announced the beginning of the end for the samurai. The crack of modern rifles at Shiroyama in 1877 marked their final extinction. The age of the sword had died to the sound of gunpowder, and Japan would never be the same. But to understand the true magnitude of what firearms did to Japanese society, we need to examine the years between Nagashino and the Meiji Restoration more closely. The transformation wasn't simply military. It was economic, social, and philosophical. The matchlock didn't just change how samurai fought, it changed who they were, what they valued, and ultimately whether they could exist at all. In the immediate aftermath of Nagashino, other daimyo scrambled to understand what had happened. Intelligence reports from the battle filtered across Japan throughout the summer of 1575. The details seemed impossible. The invincible Takeda cavalry, veterans of dozens of campaigns, destroyed in a single afternoon by peasants with guns. Traditional military theorists struggled to comprehend it. Some argued that Katsuyori had made tactical errors, that the Takeda defeat was due to poor leadership rather than the superiority of firearms. Others insisted that Nobunaga had simply gotten lucky, that weather and terrain had favoured his defensive position. But the smart daimyo, the ones who would survive the coming decades, understood immediately. Lord Wasugi Kagekatsu of Echigo, one of the most powerful warlords in northern Japan, ordered his generals to study every available detail from Nagashino. His directive to his weapons masters was blunt. I want 5,000 matchlocks within 2 years. Price is irrelevant. The Shimazu clan of Kyushu, already experienced with firearms, intensified their production. Lord Mori Terumoto of Western Honshu established new workshops in his domain. The arms race had begun in earnest. The economics of this transformation were staggering. A quality matchlock in the 1570s cost approximately the same as a good sword, perhaps 20 to 30 kan, roughly equivalent to 75 to 100 kilograms of silver. For a daimyo equipping thousands of troops, this represented an enormous investment. But unlike swords, which required individual master craftsmen working for weeks, matchlocks could be produced through division of labour. One workshop could employ dozens of smiths, each specialising in specific components. Barrels, stocks, locks, and triggers could be manufactured separately and assembled. This proto-industrial production method allowed output that would have been impossible with traditional sword-making. Sakai, the great port city near Osaka, became the Detroit of 16th century firearms production. By 1580, the city housed over 300 gunsmiths employing several thousand workers. The Sakai Town Council, composed of wealthy merchants rather than samurai, recognized the economic opportunity and actively promoted the gun trade. They negotiated with Portuguese and later Dutch traders for steady supplies of lead and saltpeter, the critical ingredients for gunpowder that Japan lacked in sufficient quantities. Chinese merchants also entered the trade, bringing saltpeter from the mainland. The firearms industry created a complex international supply chain decades before similar systems developed in Europe. The social implications were revolutionary. Gunsmiths, previously low-status craftsmen, became wealthy and influential. The Sugiura family of Kunitomo, who had started as humble metalworkers, became rich enough to establish their own warrior retinue. Merchants who controlled saltpeter imports wielded power that threatened traditional samurai dominance. Money, always important in warfare, became absolutely critical. A daimyo with silver could buy guns and powder. A daimyo without resources, no matter how noble his lineage or skilled his samurai, faced extinction. This shift empowered a new class of warriors. Men like Toyotomi Hideyoshi, who would eventually succeed Oda Nobunaga as Japan's dominant warlord, exemplified this transformation. Hideyoshi was born a peasant, the son of a foot soldier with no noble blood whatsoever. In traditional samurai society, he could never have risen beyond a Shigeru status. But in the age of firearms, where battlefield effectiveness mattered more than pedigree, a brilliant commoner could become a general. Hideyoshi understood guns, logistics, and combined arms tactics. He rose through Nobunaga's ranks by demonstrating competence rather than noble birth. By 1582, when Nobunaga was assassinated, Hideyoshi commanded armies and governed provinces. Within a decade, he would rule all of Japan, the first and only peasant to achieve such status. Hideyoshi's rise both reflected and accelerated the disruption firearms caused to samurai culture. Traditional warriors viewed him with contempt mixed with fear. He lacked the breeding, the training in classical arts, the family lineage that defined true samurai status. Yet he commanded tens of thousands of troops and controlled vast territories. His success proved that the old order was crumbling. If a peasant could rule Japan through military effectiveness, what did samurai privilege mean? The campaigns of the 1580s demonstrated how completely firearms had transformed Japanese warfare. In 1582, during the brief succession struggle following Nobunaga's death, battles routinely featured tens of thousands of arquebusiers on each side. The Battle of Shizugateg in 1583 saw Hideyoshi defeat his rival, Shibata Katsui, through superior deployment of firearms and artillery. By this point, daimyo were importing not just matchlocks but also larger weapons. Portuguese and Dutch traders sold cannons, culverins, and even siege mortars. The bombardment of fortifications, previously impossible, became routine. Castle architecture evolved rapidly in response. The great fortresses built during this period, Osaka Castle, Edo Castle, Himeji Castle, were designed specifically to withstand artillery bombardment. Walls were built with curves and angles to deflect cannon fire. Stone foundations replaced wooden ones. Interior layouts were reorganized so that defending arquebusiers could pour fire onto attackers from multiple angles. These castles still stand today, monuments to the arms race between gun and fortification. Their design reflected a harsh reality. Traditional Japanese fortifications, built for defense against arrows and siege engines, were obsolete in an age of gunpowder. The Korean invasions of 1592 and 1597 showcased Japanese firearm superiority on an international stage, but they also revealed limitations. The initial invasion saw 160,000 Japanese troops land at Busan in May 1592. Contemporary Korean accounts described the Japanese arquebus volleys as devastating. The first major engagement at Dongnei Castle showed Japanese tactics at their most effective. Korean defenders, equipped primarily with bows and spears, found themselves outranged and outgunned. Japanese forces advanced behind portable wooden shields, similar to those used at Nagashino. When they reached effective range, coordinated volleys broke Korean defensive lines. The castle fell after just a day of fighting. Similar victories followed. Seoul fell on June 12th, less than 3 weeks after the initial landing. Pyongyang fell in July. By August, Japanese forces controlled most of the Korean peninsula. Korean nobles and Chinese observers sent alarmed reports describing Japanese firepower. One Korean official wrote that Japanese guns could kill at ranges where Korean arrows fell harmlessly short. Another noted that the Japanese fired in coordinated volleys rather than individually, creating continuous fire that made counterattacks suicidal. But the invasion ultimately failed, and the reasons for failure revealed firearms limitations in 16th century warfare. Naval power proved decisive. Korean Admiral Yi Sun-sin's turtle ships, ironclad vessels armed with cannon, destroyed Japanese supply lines. Without control of the sea, the massive Japanese army in Korea couldn't be properly supplied. Guns required ammunition, which required continuous shipments of lead and powder across the Korean Strait. When Yi Sun-sin's fleet interdicted these supply lines, Japanese armies found themselves short of ammunition deep in enemy territory. Chinese intervention brought massive Ming armies into Korea, and Japanese forces faced enemies on multiple fronts. The combination of supply problems and overwhelming enemy numbers forced withdrawal. The second invasion in 1597 went even worse. Korean and Chinese forces had learned from the first campaign. They avoided frontal assaults on Japanese positions, instead using their superior numbers to surround and isolate Japanese forces. They targeted supply lines and ammunition depots. Most critically, they acquired their own firearms. Korean craftsmen, examining captured Japanese matchlocks, began producing copies. Chinese forces deployed their own guns in increasing numbers. The technological advantage that had seemed so decisive in 1592 had largely evaporated by 1598. When Hideyoshi died in September 1598, Japanese forces withdrew, having accomplished nothing but massive casualties on all sides. The Korean campaigns left Japan exhausted but militarily experienced. Hundreds of thousands of troops had seen combat. Officers had commanded large-scale operations integrating firearms with traditional weapons. The campaigns also flooded Japan with captured Korean craftsmen, particularly potters and metalworkers, who brought new techniques that further advanced Japanese manufacturing. But politically, the failed invasion weakened Hideyoshi's legacy and set the stage for the succession crisis that would lead to Tokugawa Ieyasu's rise to power. The Battle of Sekigahara in 1600 was the last great clash of the Sengoku period, and it showed firearms fully integrated into Japanese military practice. On October 21, 1600, two massive armies met in a valley in central Japan. The Eastern Army under Tokugawa Ieyasu numbered perhaps 80,000 troops. The Western Army under Ishida Mitsunari fielded 120,000. Both sides deployed tens of thousands of arquebusiers. The battle opened with artillery exchanges, with cannons firing solid shot across the valley. As armies closed and matchlock volleys crashed out from both lines. The sound was continuous, a rolling thunder that lasted for hours. But Sekigahara wasn't decided by firepower alone. Political betrayal played the crucial role. Several Western Army commanders, secretly allied with Ieyasu, switched sides mid-battle. Their troops attacked their own allies from the rear, creating chaos that firepower then exploited. The Western Army collapsed, and Ieyasu's victory was complete. 3 years later, the emperor appointed him shogun, beginning the Tokugawa period that would last 267 years. The Tokugawa peace changed everything for firearms. Ieyasu understood that guns threatened his control. Daimyo with large arsenals could potentially challenge shogunal authority. Peasants with guns could rebel against oppressive taxation. The weapons that had helped unify Japan now threatened its stability. Tokugawa policy toward firearms was subtle and sophisticated. They didn't ban guns outright, which would have been impossible and counterproductive. Instead, they regulated and limited them. In 1607, the shogunate ordered all gunsmiths to relocate to specific cities where they could be monitored. Only authorized craftsmen could produce firearms. Production quotas were established, ensuring sufficient weapons for the shogunate's needs while preventing oversupply. The import of guns and gunpowder was restricted. Portuguese traders, who had brought firearms to Japan in the first place, were expelled in 1639 as part of the broader Sakoku policy of national isolation. Dutch traders, allowed to remain on the artificial island of Dejima in Nagasaki harbour, faced strict limits on what they could import. The shogunate also controlled ammunition. Saltpeter, essential for gunpowder, had to be imported from China or Southeast Asia. The Tokugawa monopolized these imports, ensuring that even daimyo with large arsenals couldn't obtain enough powder for sustained campaigns. Lead faced similar controls. A daimyo might possess 10,000 matchlocks, but without ammunition, they were merely expensive clubs. This system of control through resource restriction proved remarkably effective. No major rebellion succeeded during the Tokugawa period despite numerous attempts. But the deeper change was cultural. In peacetime, samurai didn't need firearms. They needed administrative skills, literacy, and competence in the arts that defined civilized behavior. The Tokugawa actively promoted this transformation, encouraging samurai to become scholar bureaucrats rather than warriors. Neo-Confucian philosophy, emphasizing hierarchy, loyalty, and social harmony, became the official ideology. Samurai studied Chinese classics, practiced calligraphy, and learned tea ceremony. The sword, which had faced competition from guns during the wars, regained its central place in samurai identity, precisely because it was no longer militarily relevant. This development might seem paradoxical, but it reflects the nature of status symbols. When swords were primary weapons, their symbolic importance was secondary to their utility. Once guns made swords militarily obsolete, the sword could become purely symbolic, an emblem of samurai status uncontaminated by practical concerns. The Tokugawa period saw sword-making reach artistic heights never achieved before or since. Master smiths like Nagason Kotetsu created blades of extraordinary beauty and quality, weapons far too valuable and precious to risk in actual combat. These swords were status symbols, investments, and art objects, not fighting tools. The samurai class itself transformed during the Long Peace. By the mid-1700s, most samurai had never seen combat. They were stipended bureaucrats who administered domains, collected taxes, and maintained order. Their training in martial arts became increasingly ritualized and stylized. Kenjutsu, the practical sword-fighting techniques of the Sengoku period, evolved into kendo, a form of ritualized practice with bamboo swords. Practitioners wore protective armor and followed strict rules. It was sport and spiritual discipline, not combat training. Real sword fighting. The brutal, life-or-death struggles of the Warring States era existed only in stories and legends. Meanwhile, firearms languished. Gunsmiths continued producing matchlocks, but primarily for hunting and ceremonial purposes. The technology stagnated. While European firearms evolved from matchlocks to flintlocks to percussion caps to breech-loading rifles, Japanese guns remained essentially unchanged for 250 years. A matchlock from 1600 was functionally identical to one made in 1850. This stagnation wasn't due to lack of skill. Japanese craftsmen remained extraordinarily capable. It reflected lack of demand and, more importantly, deliberate policy to prevent firearms innovation that might destabilize society. Some domains maintained firearms expertise more actively than others. The Shimazu clan of Satsuma Domain in southern Kyushu, distant from central authority and facing occasional threats from the Ryukyu Islands, kept substantial arsenals and trained troops in firearms use. The Choshu Domain in western Honshu similarly maintained military readiness. These domains would later play crucial roles in the Meiji Restoration precisely because they had preserved military capability during the Long Peace. But most of Japan dozed, secure in isolation, unaware that the world outside was transforming. European colonial powers conquered Southeast Asia. China faced increasing pressure from Western imperialism, and military technology advanced at an accelerating pace. The Industrial Revolution enabled mass production of firearms far beyond anything possible in the 1600s. Rifling, making gun barrels spiral to spin projectiles, dramatically increased accuracy and range. The mini ball, a conical bullet that expanded to grip rifling, made rifles practical for military use. Percussion caps replaced flintlocks, providing reliable ignition in any weather. Breech-loading mechanisms allowed soldiers to reload while lying down, transforming infantry tactics. Japan knew nothing of these developments. The few Dutch traders at Dejima occasionally showed new weapons to shogunate officials, but there was little interest. Why should Japan care about foreign weapons when the nation was at peace? The Tokugawa system worked. Society was stable, orderly, and prosperous. The samurai class, though increasingly irrelevant militarily, maintained social control. There seemed no reason to change anything. Then, on July 8th, 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry's squadron of 4 American warships arrived at Ito Bay. The Japanese officials who rowed out to investigate encountered something beyond their comprehension. Perry's flagship Susquehanna was a steam-powered paddle-wheeler displacing 250 tons, larger than anything in the Japanese Navy. Its Pechans shell guns could fire explosive shells weighing 64 pounds over 3 miles. The Japanese matchlocks, the weapons that had revolutionized warfare 300 years earlier, seemed like medieval relics in comparison. Perry delivered a letter from President Millard Fillmore demanding that Japan open ports to American trade. He then sailed away, promising to return the following year for an answer. The shogunate faced an impossible situation. They could refuse, leading to war with a technologically superior power, or they could accept, violating the isolation policy that had defined the Tokugawa era and probably triggering domestic unrest. Either choice threatened the regime's survival. The arrival of Perry's black ships, as the Japanese called them, revealed how far Japan had fallen behind. The gap between Japanese matchlocks and modern American weapons was far greater than the gap between Japanese swords and matchlocks had been in 1543. Then, the technological difference was a matter of degree. Arrows and guns both killed at range, guns just did it more efficiently. But the difference between a matchlock and a Pairhands gun was qualitative. They belonged to different eras of technology. It was like comparing a Stone Age spear to a matchlock. When Perry returned in February 1854 with an even larger fleet, the shogunate capitulated. The Treaty of Kanagawa opened 2 ports to American ships and established a US consulate in Japan. Similar treaties with European powers followed. The Sakoku period of isolation ended not by choice but by force. The shogunate's weakness in the face of foreign pressure destroyed its legitimacy. If the shogun couldn't protect Japan from foreign barbarians, why should the daimyo obey him? Why should samurai remain loyal? The following years saw Japan convulsed by political crisis. Conservative samurai wanted to expel the foreigners and restore isolation. Reformers argued that Japan must modernize rapidly to avoid colonization. Violence erupted as different factions struggled for control. Modernist samurai from domains like Satsuma and Choshu began purchasing Western weapons. They bought rifles, revolvers, even artillery from European and American merchants eager to profit from Japan's chaos. These weapons were so superior to traditional Japanese arms that small forces armed with modern rifles could defeat much larger traditional armies. The superiority was demonstrated repeatedly during the conflicts of the 1860s. At the Battle of Shimonoseki in 1864, a combined fleet of British, French, Dutch, and American warships bombarded Choshu Domain's coastal fortifications after Choshu forces had fired on foreign vessels. The bombardment lasted 2 days and completely destroyed fortifications that had taken years to build. Choshu samurai defending with matchlocks and swords were helpless against naval artillery firing from beyond matchlock range. The action lasted less than 48 hours. Choshu suffered hundreds of casualties. The foreign fleet sustained minimal damage. This defeat paradoxically strengthened Choshu's modernization faction. If traditional weapons were so useless against Western arms, the only path forward was rapid modernization. Choshu began purchasing thousands of modern rifles, primarily British Enfield rifled muskets, and American Spencer repeating rifles. They hired Western military advisors to train their troops in modern tactics. Similar developments occurred in Satsuma and other forward-thinking domains. By the mid-1860s, these domains possessed military forces using weapons and tactics that made traditional samurai armies obsolete. The final crisis came in 1867 when Shogun Tokugawa Yoshinobu resigned, returning governing authority to Emperor Meiji in what became known as the Meiji Restoration. But not all Tokugawa supporters accepted this change. Forces loyal to the shogunate prepared to fight to preserve the old order. The Boshin War, lasting from 1868 to 1869, would determine whether Japan modernized or remained frozen in the past. The war's outcome was never in doubt. The imperial forces, dominated by Satsuma and Choshu troops equipped with modern weapons, faced Tokugawa forces still largely equipped with swords, spears, and matchlocks. The Battle of Toba Fushimi in January 1868 set the pattern. Imperial forces numbering perhaps 5,000 troops, most armed with modern rifles, defeated 15,000 Tokugawa troops despite being outnumbered 3-1. The Tokugawa forces charged bravely, displaying all the courage that Bushido demanded. They died bravely too, cut down by rifle fire from ranges where their matchlocks were useless. One Tokugawa survivor described the battle as incomprehensible. We advanced in good order, our flags flying, confident in our numbers and the righteousness of our cause. Then the enemy opened fire from what seemed impossible distances. Men fell before we could see the enemy clearly. Our matchlocks couldn't reach them. When we finally closed to effective range, their rifles fired so rapidly we couldn't advance through the fire. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. The Boshin War lasted 18 months, but the result was determined in the first weeks. Imperial forces captured Edo without serious fighting. Tokugawa Yoshinobu surrendered to prevent further bloodshed. Remaining Tokugawa loyalists retreated north, fighting a series of rearguard actions. The final holdouts established the Republic of Ezo on Hokkaido Island, where they lasted until May 1869 before surrendering. The war killed perhaps 5,000 to 8,000 combatants, Small numbers compared to Sengoku-era conflicts, but the political result was total. The Tokugawa shogunate ended, and with it, the old samurai order. The Meiji government moved swiftly to transform Japan. In 1871, they abolished the Han domain system, stripping daimyo of political power. In 1872, they ordered samurai to cut their top knots, the traditional hairstyle that marked warrior status. In 1873, they instituted universal conscription, creating a national army of commoner soldiers. Most drastically, in 1876, they issued the Haitore Edict, the Sword Abolition Act, prohibiting the wearing of swords in public except by military and police personnel. This single act destroyed the legal basis of samurai status. The reaction was predictable. Conservative samurai across Japan rose in rebellion, refusing to accept the destruction of their class. The largest and most serious was the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, one of the architects of the Meiji Restoration, who had come to regret the destruction of samurai culture. Saigo gathered perhaps 20,000 samurai, many still believing in the superiority of traditional Japanese weapons and fighting spirit over Western arms. The rebellion began in February 1877 when Saigo's forces seized arsenals in Kagoshima and marched north. The Japanese Imperial Army responded with 60,000 conscript troops armed with modern rifles, supported by artillery and even Gatling guns. The campaign lasted 8 months and became a systematic destruction of the samurai class. At every battle, traditional samurai tactics failed against modern firepower. Cavalry charges were shattered by rifle volleys. Sword attacks were stopped by barbed wire and machine gun fire. When samurai did close to melee range, conscript soldiers used bayonets effectively, having been trained in mass bayonet drill that negated individual sword skill. The final battle occurred on September 24, 1877, at Shiroyama Hill near Kagoshima. Saigo and his last 400 samurai, surrounded by 30,000 imperial troops, prepared for a final charge. They had almost no ammunition remaining. Most carried only swords. At dawn, they charged down the hill in a last desperate assault, seeking honourable death in combat rather than surrender. The Imperial Army opened fire, artillery shells exploded among the charging samurai, rifle volleys cut them down in waves. Within minutes, all 400 were dead or wounded. Saigo himself, wounded multiple times, committed seppuku ritual suicide rather than face capture. The age of the samurai ended on that hillside in a storm of bullets and artillery fire. The symbolism was brutal and unmistakable. The samurai, who had adopted firearms in 1543 to win battles, were destroyed in 1877 by better firearms in the hands of commoners. The weapons they had used to shatter the Takeda cavalry at Nagashino had evolved into weapons that shattered the samurai class itself. The transformation from matchlock to rifle, from feudal warfare to modern industrial war, had rendered the samurai as obsolete as the Takeda cavalry had been after Nagashino. In the decades following the Satsuma Rebellion, Japan transformed with stunning speed. The Meiji government invested heavily in industry, education and military modernization. Within 30 years, Japan possessed a modern army and navy capable of defeating major powers. In 1894 to 1895, Japan fought and defeated China in the First Sino-Japanese War. In 1904 to 1905, they fought and defeated Russia, shocking the world. A nation that had been forced open by gunboat diplomacy just 50 years earlier had become a great power. This transformation was built on lessons learned from firearms, the same pattern that destroyed the samurai class: rapid adoption of superior technology, willing to discard tradition, emphasis on efficiency over honour, drove Meiji modernization. Japanese leaders understood that survival in the modern world required embracing change no matter how painful. The samurai had learned this lesson in 1543 when they adopted matchlocks despite cultural resistance. But they failed to apply it consistently during the Tokugawa period, allowing Japan to stagnate while the world advanced. The Meiji generation was determined not to repeat that mistake. Yet even as Japan modernized ruthlessly, it preserved elements of samurai culture. The Bushido Code was reinterpreted and promoted as the national spirit. Modern Japanese soldiers were taught to fight with samurai courage and loyalty, even while using the most advanced weapons. The sword remained a symbol of Japanese identity, with officers carrying them as marks of authority. This selective preservation of tradition, while discarding obsolete practices, became a hallmark of Japanese modernization. They kept what gave meaning while abandoning what impeded progress. The matchlock arquebuses that changed everything, the weapons Portuguese traders sold to Lord Tanegashima in 1543, exist now only in museums and private collections. Collectors prize them for their beauty and craftsmanship. The barrels are often inscribed with poetry, the stocks inlaid with precious metals. They're works of art as much as weapons, testament to the skill of craftsmen who had centuries to perfect their manufacture. But they're also monuments to a revolution that consumed its own makers. The samurai embraced firearms when military necessity demanded it. They built the largest arsenal of guns in the world. They developed tactics that anticipated European innovations by decades. They proved that rapid technological adoption could overcome centuries of tradition. But they learned too late that the same ruthless logic that made them adopt firearms would eventually make them obsolete. The weapons that let them dominate Japan eventually enabled their destruction. The matchlock that shattered the Takeda cavalry in 1575 evolved into the rifle that shattered the samurai class in 1877. This is the ultimate lesson of firearms in Japan. Technology is a tiger you can ride but never fully control. Once unleashed, innovation follows its own logic regardless of social consequences. The samurai thought they were adopting a tool to win battles. They didn't realize they were adopting a revolution that would destroy their world. Every shot fired at Nagashino was a nail in samurai culture's coffin. Every matchlock produced in Sakai was another step toward the day when conscript soldiers with rifles would kill the last samurai on a hillside in Kagoshima. Today, when we think of samurai, we imagine swordsmen, masters of the blade, embodying honor and tradition. We rarely remember that for 250 years, they were also the most heavily armed society on earth, possessing more firearms than any European nation. We forget that the clash of swords we see in movies was, for crucial centuries, supplemented and often replaced by the thunder of matchlock volleys. The romanticized image of the samurai, the sword-wielding warrior bound by ancient codes, is largely a creation of the Tokugawa peace, when samurai could afford to emphasize tradition because guns had made them administrators rather than warriors. The real story is more complex and more tragic. The samurai were pragmatists when they needed to be. They adopted firearms enthusiastically when survival demanded it. They proved capable of rapid change and innovation. But this pragmatism contained the seeds of their destruction. By proving that military effectiveness mattered more than tradition, they established a principle that would eventually be used against them. When commoner conscripts with modern rifles proved more militarily effective than samurai with swords, the logic the samurai themselves had established demanded their abolition. The Portuguese traders who stepped onto Tanegashima Island in 1543, carrying 2 matchlock arquebuses, couldn't possibly have known what they were unleashing. Those 2 weapons would be copied thousands of times, eventually hundreds of thousands of times. They would transform Japanese warfare, enable the unification of Japan, make Japan the most heavily armed nation on earth, and ultimately destroy the samurai class that had adopted them. The thunder of gunpowder that first echoed across Tanegashima Island in 1543 took 334 years to fully fade, but when it finally did at Shiroyama in 1877, it had completely reshaped Japan and set the nation on a course toward modernity. The day samurai met the arquebus was the day Japanese history pivoted. Everything that came after, the unification, the peace, the isolation, the forced opening, the modernization, the wars, the eventual emergence of modern Japan, all of it flowed from that moment when Lord Tanegashima Tokitaka purchased 2 Portuguese matchlocks and ordered his swordsmiths to copy them. Gunpowder didn't just shatter tradition, it shattered an entire world and forged a new one from the fragments. The samurai who first fired those weapons at targets on Tanegashima Beach could not have imagined that they were participating in their own class's eventual suicide. But history is full of such ironies. The tools we adopt to preserve our world often become the instruments that destroy it. The matchlock saved the samurai in the 16th century and killed them in the 19th, and that contradiction defines the entire story of firearms in Japan.